Hi guys, and welcome back to the Gen Z stage. And I'm your MC and your host, Hayley Melinda. I'm an international keynote speaker, author, and change agent, and the proud investor of One Young World. So let's get into this next session. So this session is going to be called Motherboard Tongue: How Gen Z navigates online communication, what's modeled to them, and what we can expect in the future. So I have the pleasure of introducing your moderator, which is Emily. So Emily, can't wait to take it over to you.
Thank you, Hayley. Hello, Gen Z, Cognition X 2020. Thank you so much for joining us. Yes, I am Emily Chappell, and I am one of the leaders of Future Girl Corp, and also a kind of creative producer and creative strategist based in London. And Tabitha Goldstub, one of the co-founders of Cognition X, kindly asked if I would host a panel. So I was super excited to grab all these brilliant women that I thought would make a great conversation around how Gen Z are kind of navigating the digital landscape and this kind of dynamic between both of them. So yes, a little intro to who I was. So yes, I am Emily Chappell. And what we've kind of realized with the Gen Z generation is that there is little difference between the IRL and URL self for Gen Z. Online is a medium for existence and a necessity to communicate. Unlike mail or calling or face-to-face talking, Gen Z's modes of contact have all been, baked with the internet baked in, and they're constantly evolving, updating, getting, advertisers input, big business input. If you think like, Reddit, Facebook, the lot. So on this panel, I'm really excited because we're going to discuss what this has meant for Gen Z and kind of how they kind of have taken on the information, how they're taking communication in the information age, and the dynamic between, them and the platforms, how these platforms kind of host their words, thoughts, videos, and entire lives. We'll be kind of just talking about that kind of how they interact with each other. And then I'm going to ask my panel to kind of predict what future platforms and future uses might look for this generation, kind of feeding into Cognition X's this year's kind of theme is about how to get the next 10 years right. So how are we going to make these platforms right for this generation? Or maybe where are we fading now? What can we see? What can we predict to kind of prevent problems coming up? Because we'll touch on some of the subjects, but there's, the world of fake news and what else, like, being online before you want, privacy, it's bullying. There's a myriad of problems that comes with this kind of online existence. So to take this on, I have 4 really, really impressive females, and I'm so excited to have them. So let me introduce to you. So we have Damara Inglês joining us. She's a recent MA. Hey, here she is. She's a recent graduate of the London College of Fashion, and she graduated with her specialism in fashion media practice and criticism. She's a multidisciplinary fashion media practitioner. She is a creator for digital interactive experiences, and she whirls through the critical lens focused on research, trend forecasting, and creativity. She's worked with the likes of Gucci, Kering, and Microsoft, and she focuses on using AR and VR to challenge innovation within the areas of fashion communication, social media, retail spaces, the supply chain, and sustainability. So you keep busy. Oh my gosh, a lot you take on. We also have Carman joining me. She is the senior reporter at The Verge, where she covers podcasts and business, Instagram, and various creators. She hosts a wicked podcast that I'm always listening to called Why'd You Push That Button, which asks, why'd you push that button, and the kind of psychology and reasons why certain buttons exist. The one on getting verified is my favorite because the kind of elite circle that made it was incredible. So listen to that. She also hosts a YouTube series called In the Making, and prior to The Verge, she reported on cybersecurity for an industry trade publication. She focuses mainly on social phenomena, like her recent article on online graduations and basically how this phenomena then translates into the daily tech and thus our daily lives. So welcome, Ashley, all the way from New York as well. So she was like, she messaged me saying like, oh, is that 6:30? She's like, I was like, yes, it is 6:30.
It's the earliest I've woken up in quarantine, for sure.
And she was like, I don't know what I look like. I just said, put on a mask. So just say you're being like really precautious, like inside everywhere, masks are needed. So thank you so much. We also have Sonika Phakey, who is the digital marketing manager at the creative lab and agency known as the Digital Fairy, where I also previously worked. She connects the creative production and strategy teams there to inform content, e-commerce, and influencer marketing. That the Digifarian herself have worked with the likes of Adidas, Converse, Sephora, Free Periods, like basically anyone cool and girl, like, or just cool. They probably work with them. She focuses and believes on data-driven approach to digital marketing through a creative lens and always striving to deliver return on investment as well as cultural impact, which is, in this age, is very, very important. And then we also have Olivia Yallop joining me, who also works at the Digital Fairy as the creative director. She helps brands engage with the emerging trends and immerses themselves within youth culture, combining strategic intuition with an extensive understanding of internet subcultures, consumer trends, and Gen Z and millennial behaviors. Again, she's like Sonika, working with the likes of Adidas, Converse, Sephora, Free Periods, Nike, again, all these amazing brands. And this year, she's also focusing on writing a book called Under the Influence, which is the first nonfiction book to explore the social media influencer phenomenon, and it's out next year. Welcome, Livy.
Hi, guys.
So thank you all so much for joining me. I am going to kind of start, I think best to start kind of laying down the landscape of Gen Z for anyone who perhaps is new to it. I'm sure people have visited some panels, but I think it's always a good place to start. So Livy did a wicked white paper for the Digital Fairy, I would say like last year, all about Gen Z subcultures, platforms, which was, I was there at the time when she was making, at the Digital Fairy, the time she was making it, and it was so much fun to kind of see her report and cover this. And also she discovered shit posting and basically reposted her Instagram in the whole white paper. And I was like, cool, I know I'm Gen Z for sure. It's good to be covered. So that was good fun. So Livy, I'm going to ask you, often youth characteristics get confused with the characteristics of just the current youngest generation, i.e. something like rebellion tends to be a youth characteristic rather than one distinct to just Gen Z or like millennials. What is significant about Gen Z and what distinct features do they have, or ones that are more prominent with this cohort of youth?
So yeah, you're absolutely right. This is the kind of first point that we were trying to make with that white paper when it came out. So culturally, we have a tendency to conflate the characteristics of youth culture in general with those of our current youth cohort. So every generation has its activists, its creatives, its entrepreneurs, its pioneers. That's something that is kind of common to youth culture broadly through time. The trend report that Emily's referring to came out last year. It's called What the Fuck is a Gen Z? Which essentially was co-created with 600 Gen Z participants. And the aim of the report was to respond to a lot of the claims that were being made about this demographic, particularly by other agencies, trend forecasters, the media, etc. And one of our kind of main findings from the report was that Gen Z were really frustrated with these kind of generalizations about their generation and their kind of media representation. And there was a really great quote from a girl called Aislinn, who's one of the BBC's youngest kind of teen journalists. She's 18, 19, and she said, you know, this is really frustrating. We're not all activists. We're not all gender fluid. We're not all these kind of amazing, kind of slippery, new, creative, hustling individuals. There's a diverse, broad spectrum of Gen Z behaviors. And actually, you know, we have a tendency as an industry to only focus on maybe those pioneers because they tell us unique and interesting things. But of course, we can't forget that Gen Z is a huge category. You're talking about a huge amount of people. So we need to be a little bit careful when we're approaching things like category generalizations or category definitions. So you were kind of asking me to think about why this is the case, why we have this this kind of blanket approach to Gen Z. And I think there is a bit of a Gen Z industrial complex at the moment. There's a lot of hype around this generation. There's a lot of kind of a rhetoric going around about how, you've never seen anything like this generation before. You've never encountered people who act or behave or think like these people. And there are certain elements of that are true, and there are also certain elements of it that aren't. I think separating out generations is always a bit of a thankless task. Where does one end and the other one begin? We've got zillennials who are kind of half Gen Z, half millennial. I fall into that category. Where do we fit? We're also moving towards a society where, thanks to digital literacy and kind of hyperconnectivity, there maybe is a bit more of an ageless generation when it comes to certain aspects of culture than there was previously. I think we kind of, we do kind of culturally fetishize youth as well. And there's a kind of obsession with what's new, what's next. What can these people tell us about how we live now? But I think maybe a part of it is because millennials were so kind of hated or so kind of scapegoated. They were the ones who were killing off industries. They were the ones who were eating avocados and thus destroying the economy. So maybe the next generation, Gen Z, are being kind of elevated unfairly in turn. At the Digital Fairy, our approach to generations is that we tend to situate generational shifts culturally and socially. So thinking about Gen Z as a product of the conditions that they are sitting in as kind of creators of those conditions. So it's a dynamic that works both ways. So there are a couple of points that I think I would make about what are Gen Z. The first thing I think they are is kind of hyper commercialized. They are woke consumers. So this concept of wokeness, I think, is often used to apply to a kind of social justice or racial inequality conversation, but actually can be applied to a whole load of other things. I think it's a useful term to think about when talking about Gen Z. They're hyper commercialized. They understand branding. They understand themselves as brands. They have a kind of sophisticated conceptualization of their role in the information marketplace and their role in a kind of branded landscape of influencers, of TikTok, of consuming all your media through YouTube. They also grew up on dystopian cultural narratives that weren't necessarily created by them, but were created by a millennial generation for them. So things like the Hunger Games, things like Divergent. I think it's probably these things that have fostered that sense of individualism and defined Gen Z against an establishment, coupled with a kind of atomization of social media. They've also got a really permeable understanding of themselves kind of on and offline. So there's this idea that your identity is maybe not situated entirely offline or entirely online. And this quite millennial idea of the split between on and offline, I think doesn't apply when it comes to Gen Z. There is no split. It's a much more permeable barrier that they navigate kind of quite sophisticatedly and quite easily. And I think there's also a kind of absurdist streak and a quite nihilistic sense of humor that we've really seen bubbling up through grassroots Gen Z forms of culture. So things like memes, TikTok, niche internet subcultures. They've got a really, really funny sense of humor, which I think is often kind of forgotten about when we talk about them as these kind of pioneers of change and activists. It's all very serious, very kind of takes itself quite seriously, but actually they can make fun of themselves too.
Wicked. Yeah, I was going to say that kind of like that nihilistic culture is very much something. I know it's just that good point about the juxtaposition between, like, they think that, well, they have this seriousness about them and the activism and what they're working on, but then they have that sense of humor, which is almost like the world's going to end anyway, so why care? And it's just this weird dynamic where they're like fighting for the world, but also like have the humor and like it might end in a second. So I think you totally nailed it there, where you're like hyper commercialized, dystopian kind of outlook, nihilistic, and that kind of like that identity is like the kind of blend of URL and IRL, kind of, as you said.
I think there's always this tension when you think about Gen Z or when you think about any generation. And I think it's sometimes easy to think about it's helpful to think about Gen Z in terms of a dialectic rather than a necessarily like absolute definition of them. And that's where this fluidity can come as they kind of shift between identities. So yes, they are, they are very invested in DIY culture. They're very entrepreneurial. We have things like Depop or, hustle culture. But at the same time, they are also looking for stability and looking for a sense of kind of broader structural reassurance. And you can see that through the way that they petition governments to introduce a kind of broader welfare state, for example, those kind of like lefty liberal ideas that we associate with the young and they are looking for structures to sustain them. They aren't looking for this very precarious environment. And yes, you know, they are kind of maybe a potentially more genderqueer or gender fluid, unisex generation, but actually at the same time there's also this young person's desire to kind of identify with a tribe and give yourself a label and be able to kind of attach signifiers to your identity in that way. So I don't think it's necessary for us to solve this dialectic. I don't think it's necessary for us to come up with an absolute concept of Gen Z. I think we need to hold these complexities in mind when we're thinking about that generation.
Okay, wicked. I might move it. I was going to ask Ashley her question next, but I think I'll move it to Sonika, just considering what you said. Considering this, Sonika, in terms of marketing, when there's like less of these groupings and targeting and stuff, how will you go about such a kind of, I guess, fluid, or like more, if everyone's, kind of like less categorized and there's more of these kind of like more of a single, or like everyone's so hyper individual, how do you then go after that in terms of like the way you approach marketing?
Yeah, definitely. Like it's a very fragmented way of using social media. So as like a marketeer, you're always trying to take a step back and figure out what the big picture is and where Gen Z is spending their time, and where then as a brand you need to spend your time as well. In terms of like actually reaching Gen Z, it's obviously the main kind of step is understanding where they are. So I'm sure Ashley is going to talk around the kind of platform use as well. But in terms of advertising, the main thing for Gen Z is probably the fact that advertising still works really well for them. They aren't less receptive to adverts on social media, which I think is a bit of a lot of people jump to the conclusion that they would be, and that's not necessarily the truth. As Olivia kind of pointed out, they're kind of aware that Facebook is a huge corporation, and within the platforms, everybody's an influencer, everybody's got their hustles, and it's just about making sure that the content and the storytelling in that content is authentic, and then Gen Z will interact with that as an advert or not as an advert. It's not necessarily the like advert labeling that is going to put them off.
So it's more, it has to be kind of like more so embroiled in something that they're naturally following, rather than being this kind of like new space, because there's all these things about like Gen Z are so savvy to advertising, they can like suss it out in a second. And the idea of like banner blindness, so automatically knowing where not to even look on a screen because you just kind of know where the adverts are going to be. So I guess
I think that's
go on.
I was going to say that it's a very like obvious form of advertising, like banners and you know, ad blockers and things like that, and probably there is like retargeting adverts. There's some forms of advertising that are so obvious that anybody, including Gen Z, are going to be a little bit like put off, but the real bulk of advertising to Gen Z is the more inconspicuous and really well thought out influencer marketing or paid ads that are made to get a response from them, and so it's kind of effective still.
So would you say, is that kind of the most, when it comes to Gen Z, what kind of content are they kind of most receptive to? Is it that kind of stuff? And it's not even from when it comes to an advertising point, but when you're prior to creating an advert, like I guess you're seeing what it's not just the execution or like targeting them at the end, but like when you're creating an advert, like using that kind of information. So what are they kind of most receptive to in terms of like content as well as like marketing, if it's so complete?
I mean, definitely like the rise of influencer marketing has come with Gen Z, but it's almost like the original form of influencer marketing was born in like the millennial era, and now the new form of influencer marketing, Gen Z, I'm going to say the word that everyone says, but authenticity and the rise of micro influencers is really reflective of what Gen Z want to see. They want to see storytelling that is authentic and genuine, and not just, you know, product placement sort of advertising. And they want to see it from people that are like them, and that they can have a kind of affinity with and connection, and accessible influencers as well.
Do you have like any kind of recent examples where you were like, it worked really well for you guys at the DigiFairy that you're happy to share?
Yeah, I'm definitely like a campaign that we have run for Converse. That's been a bit of a long campaign, actually. It's been running over 4 months. It's a good example of how kind of like this new structure of advertising works. So how it worked is that we had different levels of influencers. So having some influencers that are bigger, that kind of establish the narrative of the campaign, and then backing this up with a whole heap of, I think there was like 50 other micro influencers that tap into different subcultures and support the kind of bigger story over a long period of time. That's also a big thing that's changed with GenZ as a brand and as a marketeer. You're looking at much longer campaigns that can build up a narrative in a genuine way over time, rather than having a 1 month big campaign moment. I mean, you might have like small product drops, and newness is still really important, but having a kind of long-term storytelling strategy using influencers and kind of traditional forms of advertising is really important.
So it's almost like a tree, it's like it has like a kind of the type of influencer one has, you leverage that first and then you kind of like trickle it out and redistribute, considering.
Yeah, that's one way of doing it, but definitely like quantity of input is really important, because at the end of the day we want the marketing that we do to be kind of the best campaigns are the ones that are taken on by the consumer and they feel like part of it. So a way of getting that to happen and almost getting to that tipping point is using lots of micro influencers and to kind of start that off, and then consumers join the movement or whatever the campaign is.
Yeah, like the more kind of activation kind of filled and like, yeah, you're part of the story or contributing to it. I'm seeing that more and more now. Ashley, I'm gonna head over to you now. So as you are a reporter at The Verge and cover all the latest technologies, that is a bit self-explanatory, you're welcome. And you're always learning why people use certain platforms or certain buttons and certain technologies. Is there something that you've seen that Gen Z are most receptive to, or from what you've covered?
Yeah, so it's funny because when I was thinking about how to answer this question, I was like, oh my God, there are just so many different ways to go with this. But I think we've kind of hit on some trends here that speak to Gen Z. So, we kind of mentioned groups. What we're really seeing is kind of, the older way of doing things. I think what we would think of as maybe Facebook and the wall, where you were kind of broadcasting broadly your thoughts, opinions, whatever. And what we're really seeing with Gen Z is these smaller group chats, smaller groups talking to each other. We see that, Instagram recently launched an app called Threads, which hasn't gotten much traction from what I can tell, but the idea behind it is really a place where you can just group chat with your friends. We see group chat apps. People are really trying to make their circles smaller. Snapchat was kind of built on this entire idea of friend streaks and like talking directly to your friends rather than broadcasting to the world. And Gen Z really came up with Snapchat. And Snapchat also really pioneered this idea of ephemeral content. So kind of, again, going against the wall idea where what you post isn't forever, it disappears. And Instagram, of course, copied that idea with stories. And that is a huge, huge part of, I think, what Gen Z likes to see, which also leads to, Instagram grids. That is part of this whole permanent idea, but now they have archiving, and that is essential because it is allowing Gen Z to kind of curate their aesthetic, their style, where their online persona is them showing themselves. So by being able to archive, they can kind of curate themselves and show off what they're into now versus who they were maybe in the past. And then one other thing I just wanted to know, and I'm happy to keep going or dive into something more if you want. But one thing I also just wanted to know is I think Gen Z is really into location sharing, which I think is super interesting. We see that with that Threads app I talked about, Snap Maps, where you can see where your friends are. And I think it's just kind of this concept of, okay, where are my friends? Are they home? Can we hang out right now? Maybe that means we're going to just hang out online, which we've seen with Animal Crossing and Fortnite. Or maybe it means I can just chat them and we're going to hang out in person in the neighborhood or something. So I think hanging out online, knowing where your friends are, being able to just keep it within the friend circle and not necessarily talk to everybody all at once that are some of the really big trends we see.
Yeah, I know the location thing, because I guess it has that mix of like, oh my gosh, when it says like WhatsApp's like, can it follow you when you're not on the app? And I'm like, heck no, you can't. I don't want you knowing where I'm at. But then I have other times where I'm on my Instagram and I literally will post a story, just be like, yo, who's in this area? Because I just want to, like, I'm not ready to go home, but I want to know who's around. So it's
yeah, I used to be hesitant about location sharing, but now I love it because it just makes it easier to know where your friends are and if you're bugging them or not, if you can hang out, if you can't, like, it just kind of streamlines conversation so you know that whether you can talk or not, basically.
Yeah, and I guess it's also considering like the change of like where friendships are located, because like back in the day where it would be through school and just kind of through your location, where now it's like completely online. And what's the point of location if you're making a friend who's like completely like remote to you? So it is an interesting thing that's quite popular.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to bring up. I actually spoke with Tinder's CEO very recently, and Tinder's target audience is Gen Z, which is why I bring it up. And especially with the pandemic, they just launched video chat. They're also launching something called global mode that allows you to match with people around the world, regardless of where you live, and it's free. And when I was talking to him about this, he really pointed out and made it sound like basically Gen Z, he kind of made it sound like Tiger King is a love language, where essentially we're all consuming the same content. Netflix is the same for you in the UK as it is for me here in New York. You and I have a cultural language that we can talk about. We see the same memes online. There is a lot in common between us, and potentially more in common between us than there could be even if you lived next door to me. We're consuming the same mass media, which means that we can have kind of a connection. And with Tinder's case, people can date because they have this connection online, and it sort of suggests that maybe there's a future in which you don't need to be nearby to date or even to be friends.
Oh my gosh, that's insane. And the whole the more like VR and like you can kind of transport people in the weirdest way, I feel like that's going to be an interesting development. And speaking of Damara, I think I'll go to you because you are on your Instagram, you're a self-proclaimed fashion tech cyborg, which perhaps would be something a bit obscure. If you said that maybe 10 years ago, you'd be like, is this lady okay? But now it's very understood and it's like kind of more commonplace now. So what does it mean to kind of be this to you, and how do you kind of gain that label?
Above it all, when I was working on my master's project, I started researching the Cyborg Manifest by Donna Haraway. And the book is actually from the 80s, but it's so relevant today. And she basically defines the cyborg as anyone that uses technological tools as a way of expressing who they are. So if you use the typing machine in the 60s, by her theory, you are considered some kind of cyborg. I decided to kind of absorb this terminology in relation to me and in relation to my work, because as post-humans, we are, in my mind, the best example of what a cyborg is. Because a cyborg is the tension between the biological and the virtual or the technological. And nowadays, we live in between two realities, being them fluid or not, but we live between the online and the offline. And fashion is highly associated with dressing and covering your physical bodies for connotations and ideals that are very associated with physical societies as well. So the notion of fashion cyborgism for me is when fashion starts being developed for the virtual stage. And what will the threads and the cloth of our cyborg fashion look like. So it's beyond just covering your body. It's about protecting your body in the digital stage whilst also expressing yourself in a way. It's a quite abstract and experimental way of feeling and engaging with fashion.
Yeah, okay. And so what kind of ways do you like feel you're yourself, you're like, I guess we've all touched on this conflation of like this digital like real, but where do you feel most yourself if you're this kind of like cyborg kind of type? But as you just said, it's kind of like any touch of technology makes you a cyborg. So I guess everyone's finding their own calibration. But yeah, for yourself, where do you feel most yourself?
Somewhere like on a scale of 0 to 100, somewhere between being in the park with my friends and asking them to record me wearing my latest filter, somewhere between hanging out in a physical space with friends and still having this layer of technology. And the 100% would definitely be the Google Tilt Brush software that you can access using a virtual reality headset. Okay. And for me, that's amazing. And that's where I discovered myself. That's where I came out of the closet as a cyborg, let's say. Because using the Google Tilt Brush, your body literally becomes a cursor and a tool of a virtual space. And it was the first time that I actually experimented technology in a way that I'm not controlling the computer, I'm not typing keys on a keyboard or trying to design something with a trackpad. I'm actually inside that space and I am controlling the computer as much as it is also controlling my sense of self and my sense of body.
Okay. Mad. So I feel like this will be the future and we will have those in our house and we'll just like, again, this quasi digital real person. So I'm going to go on to the next question. So kind of still staying in that kind of AI or like CGI world. There's little Michaela, who's an influencer, who I feel like is this individual who kind of embodies all these different kind of dynamics of like platform, influence, marketing, and then also CGI. So I have a question for each of you just on kind of her. So Livy, because you had little Michaela feature in the what the fuck is the GenZ white paper, can you kind of explain her existence and how the kids receive her? So like what do they think?
Yeah, of course. So I would urge anyone who is currently connected to a phone in any way, which I'm assuming everyone is, just to look up at Little Mick, just so that you have some kind of context to this conversation. Little Mick is a robot influencer, essentially, a kind of CGI animated influencer, who has been created by a transhumanist narrative studio, they call themselves, called Brud, who have essentially created an artificial influencer. And so she acts and behaves very much like a kind of fashion influencer who is real, who is human, but she is sentient, she's conscious of her status and her identity as a robot. And the Digital Fairy have actually worked with Lil Michaela on a client basis. She's one of our clients. We worked with her last year to develop her merch line and also to launch something called Club 404, which is a kind of digital participation community for her and her fans. It's a really interesting project. I think it's interesting to consider this not as a kind of version of an influencer, but as a kind of literal embodiment of transhumanist beliefs, as a kind of scientific and artistic research practice. I think when considering why a kind of model like this is so interesting and so relevant to today's conversations, I think we need to caveat that this is actually not something new. Animated characters that entertain or provoke ideas or start conversations are nothing new. Little Mick is kind of, in a way, just the Mickey Mouse of 2020, just with kind of souped up technological abilities behind her. And also the fact that it's not just AI influencers or CGI influencers who are pushing forward this trend. It's also 3D garments, it's Fortnite, it's Animal Crossing, it's Zepeto, it's Memoji, that let you kind of recreate yourself. I think, why are people so receptive to this? Because I think we're going through a really interesting phase culturally where we are thinking about bridging these two previously disparate, previously kind of divided areas of our lives into this like phygital, fluid existence. So for Gen Z, as people have kind of picked up on, reality no longer needs to be situated in the real world anymore. And they are prepared to invest in digital world building. So if you look at the kind of dynamics of this new development, there's a really interesting reversal. If you think that millennials grew up with Sims, and Sims was probably the most broadly accessed, widely available example of digital world building for that generation, Sims was all about recreating your sense of identity in a digital format. That was the dynamic. It was very kind of clear. And actually now it's maybe more about making yourself into a robot. So that dynamic has been flipped, has been turned on its head. And Damara's example of that is a really, really good example. Another example is face filters, where it's not about trying to make a digital world look and resemble like our own. It's about trying to make ourselves look and resemble like the digital world. And I think little Michaela in the Verge project does this in a really interesting way, not because she is a kind of robot pretending to be a person, but because she's aware that she's a robot pretending to be a person. And I think that's quite an interesting like meta narrative, and that affords kind of the next stage of the conversation around this kind of AI CGI influencer discussion. I don't know whether that anyone else would agree or disagree with that.
I think, yeah, it seems like, yeah, you found the new kind of like, yeah, calibration of what is building identity. And yes, it was like this, like, here it is, it's in digital and then it's in real life. But now it's like the digital world's like feeding the self, and like almost you're building your personality informed through digital and then expressing it again, like re-digitally.
Yeah, exactly. In previous iterations of like digital identity recreation online, were very much, they didn't break the fourth wall. They weren't aware of their own artificiality. But I think breaking through that barrier is a really significant and really interesting.
Yeah.
So if anyone has her Instagram up open, you can see that she refers to herself as a robot, and she talks about robot rights, and she talks about struggling, having a power struggle with her creators. So she's really kind of enacting things that previously would have been discussed through movies or through debates around AI and ethics. She's actually kind of embodying that in a way that feels like it's part of culture for the first time. I think that's what's most interesting. It was incredibly weird to receive feedback from our client.
You're like, have you just made this up?
A really like interesting new model for working between an agency and a client, for sure.
Yeah. I had one more question for you guys on privacy, but as we have 5 minutes left, I think I'll just head to the last question, because it'd be great to have all of your input on it. So I think it's interesting what I've, for myself, it's like with all these platforms, I just wonder where they're going to go to, because you have things like starter kits where there's basically, well, like there's like starter kits, algorithms, and new platforms, but like what will advertising in these platforms look like in the coming years? Because if you have places like Depop where there's all these subcultures, and then you kind of start to see this homogenizing of types of people. So you have like your starter packs for the likes of like the Y2K girl, or like the kind of like skater boy, and so there are these kind of like people coming together. And then also with algorithms, you're basically kind of refeeding what you already like. So then again, it's this another homogenizing of like the self of like what I already like. So I say, if you look at my Spotify likes, it's literally just neo soul of the same but different, but just a lot of it. But I love it. I think Amy Winehouse started that off, and now I just have like a myriad of kind of similar new versions. So again, it's kind of like I haven't been able to like evolve much or like diversify in terms of my music because of all this kind of like appeasing what I already like. But then there's also these worlds where Gen Z, I feel like, will they kind of get frustrated with these platforms, and they'll be so savvy that they can create their own. So I don't know what you guys kind of think, like, will Gen Z kind of pioneer these new spaces that are kind of away from algorithms, where they can still kind of discover and they'll kind of fragment, and then there'll be even more kind of like this unique thing? Or again, like Ashley was saying, the kind of idea of like, we have these cultural contexts over space. Like we both know what Tiger King is, but we live in different places. So then there's these ideas like things becoming kind of the same. So what do you guys kind of think, perhaps?
I think that every generation has points that kind of bring them together. Like the TV somehow also brought people together. People that didn't necessarily live in the same place also had the same experiences or watched the same things. But at the same time, every generation also finds necessity for differentiation and for, let's say, kickstarting culture beyond what is expected and beyond the mainstream. So I definitely think that culture will be more homogeneous, but at the same time, there will be points of difference that will come out of it. For example, GenZers are a lot on Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, that are very centralized social medias, where you even have CGI influencers with like these completely unattainable beauty ideals. It's like the motherland of millennial anxiety. But then at the same time, there are new apps as the New Life.ai, which are apps specifically that you can only access by invitation. So you need to have a friend inside to invite you. And these apps are dedicated to find artists in an environment that is not centralized and not based on the algorithm of likes and views. So I think this is a great example of how Gen Zs look for their freedom away from these algorithms. Yeah.
And then Ashley, what's your perspective on this?
You know, it's hard because I understand the inclination to say for anyone to want to get away from the algorithm. Like it kind of sucks to be programmed against. But at the same time, I don't really see that going away, only because it is so effective for advertising. And in situations where maybe there's platforms that aren't following a likes system, or at least outward metrics, visible metrics, like Instagram is experimenting, you know, with no likes. I think there's still signals that they can look for. Like it's even just how long you stare at a photo, they could know that information. And even with group chats, which again is, you know, not broadcast material, but is something that, you know, is just between us, let's say, you know, that's still data they can collect about what you're talking about or look for keywords. I mean, Gmail exists and they can see what you're emailing about. So I think that, you know, you're always going to be programmed against, whether it's algorithmically generated or not. And kind of when I look forward to the future, I just sort of see that becoming more sophisticated. We're seeing it happening in the podcast space now, where that's kind of the last frontier of no targeted advertising. And with Spotify kind of coming in, there's a lot more to that, but basically with Spotify coming in and dynamic advertising, like we're seeing, you know, kind of the last frontier here with podcasting. And I imagine as we go forward, we'll see it in even more evolving platforms and different technologies.
Wicked. Okay, we have just hit 45 minutes, but I would, we have 1 minute, says Director Paul. So I don't know if, Sonika, you want to add a last kind of chime into this thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting at the moment. We've obviously been going through massive cultural change with COVID and now the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think there is an awareness growing of the echo chamber and the negative impact of that. And it's been interesting throughout COVID also seeing these new platforms like House Party pop up for a week and then disappear.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I think that's going to happen more and more. We're going to see these kind of like one-hit wonder, quick fire platforms popping up to serve a short-term interest. That might help us get out this echo chamber as well. It was interesting to see that Twitter has record downloads over the past week. So there's obviously a want to get out of Instagram and Facebook, whether that means going back to Twitter, going to TikTok, or maybe somewhere new.
Yeah, I guess that's so interesting because I guess, yeah, it's almost like also the frustration with the Facebook ownership of different platforms. And if you have a rejection for them, then you have to kind of like reject either WhatsApp or Instagram as well. And I guess it's also this news flurry of like what's going on with Black Lives Matter movements and COVID. It's like Twitter's almost the, you know, the democratized news. So that's where you get that from, rather than the fake news from the big publishers.
Yeah.
Okay, wicked. So thank you girls so much. I thought that was such a brilliant conversation and touched on a lot of things in regards to Gen Z and how they're kind of living online. So I just want to say thank you so much. And I'm going to pass back over to, well, I'm going to pass to Hayley, but after this we'll have a Q&A for anyone who wants to ask these girls some questions. So thank you guys, and head over to Hayley.
Thank you so much, ladies. That was an amazing conversation. I'm super excited now for the Q&A, just seeing how amazing that is. So thank you so much, Emily, for being a great host of that. So guys, you have heard it. You've heard the amazing discussions. And now you have literally got a 15-minute break for you to run, do what you need to do, stretch, as I said, because it's about to be lit. We're coming back again at 1 p.m. So guys, I look forward to seeing you guys again. I'm your host, Hayley Melinda, and this is CogX, the Gen Z stage, and I'll see you guys in a bit.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.